So if we could start with your full name, please.
Okay, Robert Emmett Blackmore. Two
And,
two T's.
and where and when were you born?
I was born in East LA in a home, in my parents' home, in September the 12th, 1924.
Okay. So how old does that make you currently?
It makes me about 93.
And which branch of the military did you serve with?
I was in the amphibious force in the U.S. Navy.
Okay. And what years did you serve?
I served, as it turns out, three years to the day, only by accident. January the 19th, 1943 to January the 19th, 1946.
And what was your rate in the Navy?
When I was discharged from the Navy, I was a shipfitter second class.
And did you receive any medals for your service?
No.
Okay. And did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
Okay, so I'd like to talk briefly about your childhood and growing up. You said you
Okay.
were born in East LA. Can you tell me about your parents and your family life?
Sure. My dad was living in Galway, Ireland, and he had an older brother that had come over here to the United States, and the older brother was up in San Francisco, and for the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and he was never heard from again. He was buried, and they lost thousands of people in that '06 earthquake. Took down all of San Francisco. And my grandmother, Mary Jane, my dad's mother, knew that he was still alive. And so she gathered what was left of the family in Galway, Ireland, which was my brother and five of his sisters and brothers, and her husband, who unfortunately was an alcoholic. And she brought the whole mess over to New York, and they went through the facilities there. And one of the other brothers was up in Butte, Montana, so they all went to Butte, Montana. And my grandmother lost her husband. He was out with a group, and they were coming back in a wagon carried by horses, and they had been drinking, and he fell off the wagon, and nobody even missed him, and they found him frozen to death on the side of the road the next morning. So that was the end of her husband. So she was a widow now with her kids. And of course she never found her son in San Francisco, but it was because of her that I ended up in East LA when my dad married there.
Now, did you have any siblings growing up?
Yes, I have 5 brothers and sisters. We had 3 and 3, ended up 3 boys and 3 girls.
And where did you fall in line?
I was the eldest.
And were you guys close as a family?
We were unbelievably close. We've never been in an argument with anyone in our whole family in all of these years. And all the time I was in the South Pacific, I had my mother and father and 5 kids praying for me every night.
Were Were you the only one that served during World
Yeah,
War II?
yes.
Now, growing up during the Depression, did you guys suffer any hardships
My dad was a pretty good hustler, and he saw. Actually, he was driving what they called a jitney, and he broke his arm and broke his wrist cranking his jitney, and so he couldn't drive the jitney anymore. So he looked in the newspaper, and a man had a box lunch thing downtown Los Angeles. So Hoffman was his name. So my dad went down and talked to Mr. Hoffman, and Hoffman says, "Okay," he says, "Here you go." He says, "I'm going to give you 10 lunches here, and you go down to the corner of Washington and Alameda and sell them just like you would sell a newspaper, because there are a lot of steel mills down there, and they're all guys going to work." Well, he sold the 10 box lunches just like that. Before you know it, he was moving about 100 box lunches, and it was working pretty good. When he showed up one day, and here was a pretty girl in a short skirt with 100 lunches. She sold 100 lunches. My dad didn't sell one.
Tough competition there.
Well, yeah, I mean, these were all guys. These were all old steel worker guys, and when they saw the pretty chick, I mean, that's where they bought their lunch, you know. So my dad then got a company. Mr. Hoffman said, "Well, I know this building downtown L.A., and he said, "It's Graco Manufacturing. They make men's dress shirts and ties. And there's about 300 girls working there. Most of them are little Mexican gals, but there were all kinds of people there." And so my dad would take his truck down. He built a little cart out of angle iron, and would put sandwiches and things on there, and then he would go up the freight elevator and sell up and down the aisles to these 300 girls. They could buy stuff for lunch and so forth. And so I used to go with him. I was only 13, 14 years old. And then he got another building, Fern Shoe Manufacturing, about 300 people at 30th and Grand. And so he would leave me in the alley there, and I would sit there and sell to the truck drivers driving through the alley. And then at about 2 o'clock, I would load up a little cart that they had there, and I would go up and down the aisle and sell the girls Cokes and candies for the afternoon. And then about 4:30, my dad would pick me up and we'd go home. And that's how I spent my summers. So I learned the business pretty well right there while I was very, very young.
Now, did you work any other jobs, not associated with your father or your family?
Oh yeah, I had 2 jobs, and both I had the same pay for both of them. I got 25 cents an hour for playing the piano for a bunch of Meglin kids that were learning how to tap dance. And I had only had one tune memorized, "A Parade of Wooden Soldiers." I played it over and over and over again, and I got 25 cents an hour. Then I found out that they needed somebody to clean the halls at St. Mary's Academy, beautiful old academy that was built on Slauson and Crenshaw, and it built in 1926. And I worked there with another friend of mine, and we swept the halls every after school for a couple of years. Once again, 25 cents an hour.
And how old were you at this time?
Well, I was 15, 16, 17.
So you're still in high school yourself.
Yeah. I'm still in high school.
And which high school did you
I went to
attend?
Mount Carmel High School, a Catholic high school, and I let's see. Well, in the middle of my senior year, I decided I wanted to go in the Navy, and so I dropped out of Mount Carmel in the middle of my senior year in January, and went in on January 19th. And so that was just what I wanted to do, and it worked out well.
Now, rewinding just a little bit, do you remember where you were when Pearl Harbor was attacked?
Yes, I do, exactly. I was at Walter Myers gas station, Texaco gas station, at the corner of West Boulevard and Slauson, and I was putting a new axle in my 34 three-window Ford Coupe that I had just bought, and it was a hot car. It really drove well. An old man had taken that car, the engine, it had a 1937 engine in it, and he had taken it down and he had mic'd everything on the thing. And it's the only Ford I've ever seen or owned that you could not hear it running when it was running. It was that smooth. And it was a good, fast car, and I used to go out looking for races.
So did you hear the announcement come over the radio, or how did you?
No, somebody walked up and said they bombed Pearl Harbor, and my answer was, "Where is Pearl Harbor?" Because I had no idea at that time, and but I still had a couple of years as a civilian before I went into the Navy.
Did you comprehend sort of what that meant at the time?
No. I mean, no, I didn't. I don't remember being terribly scared or upset. And I do remember that, we had air raid alerts in Los Angeles, blackouts. And I loved the blackouts because my girlfriend lived about 2 blocks away. And we would go up there, and then we have a blackout. We could sit out on the lawn and kiss, and nobody knew.
So you were still attending school and working for those few years after the U.S. joined the war until you finally decided you wanted to join the effort as well.
Right, exactly.
Now, what was it that made you want to join the Navy?
Well, I kind of thought I liked boats. I didn't know anything about boats, but at that time I was a surfer. I used to body surf every day, and so I love the ocean and all that, and that's why I thought the Navy sounds like the place to go. And so there were 3 of us that we were all buddies, Bob Gruber and John Garzon and myself. And Bob Gruber ended up going into the Army, and John Garzon was going to join the Navy with me. The only trouble is he was about 6 months younger than me. He wasn't quite 18 yet, and I was 18. His mother refused him to join the Navy, and he was really upset because I left and went down and joined the Navy in San Diego. And then his mother came to John and she said, "John, if you want to get in the service, I'll sign for you to go into the Coast Guard," thinking that was much safer that was her thinking. And so John took it, So he went in the Coast Guard, and 2 years later, I was on the USS Dixie at this time, and I was back in Guadalcanal, and my mother wrote me that John Garrison was on the USS Serpents, a cargo ship for the Coast Guard. I looked up, and sure enough, the USS Serpents was over in Tulagi, right across from Guadalcanal. So I got permission off the ship to go over there, and I found John. There's a picture of us up on the wall there. And when John and I were together, he got a letter that Bob Gruber was killed in Normandy. And so we felt terrible about that. It was one of our 3 buddies. And so it was time for my ship to leave. So I said goodbye to John, and they were going down to New Zealand. I was jealous because that's where the girls were, And so they went to New Zealand, and 2 weeks after I left them in Guadalcanal, they were loading depth charges in New Zealand, and they exploded. And it was the biggest loss they've ever had in the U.S. Coast Guard ever. 160 guys, I think it was. And at the graveyard in Washington, D.C., they have a big monument there for the Coast Guard. Biggest loss they ever had. And John was one that was lost, too. So I lost my 2 friends in a matter of a couple of weeks.
Must have been tough for you.
It was. Well, yes, it was, but things were moving so fast that you didn't have much time to mourn, We just kept moving.
Kind of forced to move on. You got a job to do still.
Yeah.
Now, can we'll talk about your boot camp experience. Where did you attend?
I went in San Diego. I went to boot camp, and that was I got quite an education there. I was very sheltered. I mean, I hadn't done anything sexually at all, and they put us in a thing the first night we were there, and all of a sudden about midnight, all hell broke loose, and here comes about 40 guys that just came in on a train or something, and they threw them into this bunkhouse where we were, and they were all from Tennessee. And I heard things that I'd never even thought of about sexual acts with animals, etc., etc. that I didn't know any of that existed until that night. So that was my introduction into the Navy.
Now, how long did you spend down in San Diego?
Well, I went to, I think 8 weeks or something was the boot camp. And then they asked me what I wanted to do. And I had 2 or 3 choices, and one of them, when I saw the amphibious force, that sounded like it'd be interesting to me. So I joined the amphibious force, and that's what they sent me over to North Island, and I learned to drive landing craft and so forth, and went to about 6 weeks of school. And then I was transferred up to San Francisco, and I stopped at the Los Angeles station. I had about a 2-hour thing. And I had met this pretty girl when I was home from boot camp on leave, and at a USO thing. And so I prevailed on my mother to call this girl, and my mother brought the girl down to the train station. I had a 2-hour layover there going to San Francisco. And my poor mother, I went over by a palm tree and necked with my girlfriend for 2 hours. My mother just waiting. My mother was an angel. And I got back on board and went to San Francisco.
Now, did you have any words with your mother before you left?
No, she was a good woman. She knew what had to be done, and she was all for. I mean, she was patriotic as you could be.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure she was sad to see you go.
Oh, of course, but
I knew that.
Yeah, but and she knew that she could pray enough to get me home, and she did.
Now, had you received your orders at this point? Do you know where?
No. It was very interesting because we got up to there, and so we were in receivership. But we were waiting for assignment, and it turns out that they issued us a bunch of heavy clothing. They got great big sheepskin jackets and big hats and everything. And it looked like we were going someplace cold. Years later, I found out that when we invaded Attu up in Alaska, was on the same date that we invaded Vela La Vela in the South Pacific. And at the last minute, they took all this heavy clothing away from us and just put us on a ship. And I was going to the South Pacific instead of Attu. But it was 60 years later that I found out that both invasions were on the same day.
So there's a chance that you could have been headed.
Well, I know that's where I know they were planning for us to go to Attu. I'm sure that's what it was, because we didn't fool around. By the time I left on the ship from Port Hueneme, is where we left from, and
that's the central coast of California.
Yeah, and when we left, we didn't fool around. I mean, we left in July the 3rd, and we invaded Vela La Vela on August the 15th.
So it was pretty quick.
Very quick. And a lot happened in between.
So did you leave on a troop ship, or were you
No,
assigned to?
I went. Okay, here we go. I was in New Caledonia, and okay, so they said, okay, you're going somewhere. They didn't tell us where we're going, and we started off, and we went on the John Penn. It was an attack transport. They had a lot of landing craft on board, and so they could use that transport to bring a lot of troops in and then get them off with the landing craft. And so when we get on board, we see 3 guys that we had trained with down in North Island in the amphibious force. They were our ship's company, running the landing craft off of this ship. Well, halfway up towards Guadalcanal, an announcement came over the air on the ship that our group was called Boat Pool 9. We had 125 people in our boat pool, and we were about 3/4 Navy and about 1/4 Coast Guard. And so they needed 3 or 4 more people for us. We were short a few people for our thing. So they asked for volunteers from the ship's company, the guys that were running the boats, if they wanted to go with us. So we sat up there and talked about it, and then we heard that the ship, the John Penn, was going to go to New Zealand after they dropped us off at Guadalcanal. And we said, hey, you guys, first of all, they were going to join so we'd all be together again. And then we said, hey, you guys are going to New Zealand, you know, don't volunteer. We don't know where we're going, you know. So they did not volunteer. I got off of the John Penn at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, went on shore at Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was secure by this time. It was all pretty well all American. And I got off at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 6:30 I was standing on the beach, and a Japanese torpedo plane came over, dropped a torpedo, and hit the John Penn right in the stern. That's where my friend's general quarters was, on the 5-inch gun on the stern, and it sunk the John Penn right there. And I understand today John Penn is one of the prime scuba diving spots in Guadalcanal, because the ship had already destroyed the stern, but it sunk the ship and killed, I think, about 60 or 70 guys were killed, including our 3 Finns. And it's a favorite spot now because it was pretty well intact, the whole ship. And so that was the end of that.
Did you see, were you standing, did you see
I watched it happen, yeah.
And what are you thinking while
I'm thinking I better get the hell under or something. You know, but it was one single torpedo plane came in, and I heard this, and I don't know what the details of it, but the son of Toto or some Japanese big Yamamoto or one of those guys, the son had been killed on this particular day a year ago. And so they sent this token thing up. They sent a torpedo plane up, and he made a hit. And I don't know if the torpedo plane survived or not.
But you had just been on that ship you said
2 hours. 2 hours earlier I was on the ship, yeah. So that was a close call. So now we get the word we're on our way to somewhere, and they put us on an LSTs. And an LST, as you know, is about 300-foot ship, and we had trucks on board, and we had all kinds of heavy equipment and tractors and everything. And so we landed at Vella La Vella about noon, and we started unloading stuff. There was no Japanese apparent. There were Japanese on the island, but they weren't organized. They didn't make an organized resistance to our landing, and but they did. They were bombing and strafing us with airplanes, and so we, for some reason, I took all of my Navy gear, my sea bag and everything, and I took it off the LST and put it in the sand alongside the ship, and went back to working on unloading things off the ship. And all of a sudden word comes out that the ship there was a full moon that night, and they were afraid, the powers to be were afraid if they left the ship there with a full moon that it would get bombed at night. And so they said they want the LST to go back out. It was only a quarter unloaded. Most of the stuff was still on. And they said, we'll bring it back in the morning and load it. So all of my guys that I was with, they all got back on the LST. And I heard about it, and I was further up taking something somewhere. And I said, oh man, I got to get back on the LST. It's going to leave. So I'm running down to get on it, and here comes a Zero over the trees, and he's strafing. And I fell down behind a coconut log while he went over me, and while he was strafing, the LST backed off, and it was gone. Left me. Now I'm here with the Marines. The Marines, we had brought the Marines in. And so I found a Marine lieutenant somewhere, and I said, I'm supposed to be on that LST, but it left me. And he said, okay. He said, come with me. And he showed me a hole, a foxhole. He said, get in there. There were 2 Marines in there already. And he says, get in there. And he said, if you come out before daylight, you're dead, because we're going to have guards on top. We don't know what's going on yet with the Japanese. And anybody on the top we're going to shoot them. So don't come out of that. And so, well, I never even talked to these 2 Marines. They were as scared as I was. We were scared to death, you know. And so we're there. Now, my dad was a great storyteller, being an Irishman from Galway. And he started being in first person. He wasn't in World War I, but he heard all the stories from the guys coming back from World War I about being in the trenches with rats 8 inches, 10 inches long, crawling over them and biting them, you know. And so I'm laying there petrified in this thing, and I feel something going over my leg. And all I could see was a rat that long, you know? And it went on all night, back and forth across my legs. Never bit me or anything until morning, when I could see, and it was a couple of damn sand crabs. So I wrote my dad a nasty letter from there.
Putting those thoughts in your head.
Right. So now we're on the island, and what we're doing, we brought a bunch of New Zealanders in, and Army guys, and we were taking them with the landing craft and going around different parts of the island and making little mini landings where we could rout out the Japanese who were there. And I remember one of my good friends, he was a Coast Guard guy, and he was driving one of the boats in, and there was a sniper up in one of the palm trees, and the sniper shot him. He was on the wheel of the landing craft, and the bullet passed right across his chest like this, drew blood, but didn't hurt a rib or anything, just barely grazed him across. And he ended up with a great scar right across there and a Purple Heart. And I was so jealous of him. That's the kind of wound you want to get.
Did he stay in the service after that?
I don't know. I lost track of him. I know his name. I can't think of it in a moment. But I should have checked out with him. But anyhow, so we were half Coast Guard and half Navy in our thing. So here I am. I am working on the boats, and one of the our first replacements came in, and I looked at the list, and there was a Blackmore on there, named Blackmore, and I said, "Oh my gosh!" So I went. I had already got permission. We just about had the airfield was just about ready to accept airplanes now. In fact, I think it was accepting airplanes, and Pappy Boyington and his crew took over that airfield. That all the TV stories, and they did everything. That was all on Vella La Vella at that airfield that we built there for Pappy Boyington. And so I went down and I found this guy. There was about 12 guys that they brought in, replacements for us, and Blackmore, and he was from Illinois somewhere, and we talked for about 10 minutes, and we decided we didn't have anything going, you know. It's a fairly unfamiliar name, but nevertheless. So I went on, and I went up to the airfield, and I spent overnight up there visiting my friend, a motor mechanic, working on the Corsairs. And so they immediately assigned this Blackmore to one of the boats, and he was out on the boat the next day, and 2 Corsairs came by, and what they used to do, they would dive down and see if it was a Japanese junk or one of our landing craft. And they would go down over us, and when they see that we were friendly, they would wiggle their wings and go on, you know. Well, I guess it was 2 of them. So the first one came down, he wiggled his wings, and this other guy was gun-ho, and he thought he was strafing them. And he strafed our ship and killed Blackmore. And everybody, I'd been there from day one, everyone on the island knew who I was, you know, in our group. And they all thought I had been killed because nobody knew this new guy came in.
I heard Blackmore.
Yeah, right, yeah. And so I came back the next day, and I walked in and they thought they were seeing a ghost. Yeah. They were turning white and everything else. Couldn't believe it, you know.
How did they react?
Oh, there were crazy reactions, you know. I mean, it was turned out to be semi-funny. I mean, it wasn't funny. Poor Blackmore died, you know, but
you probably didn't know why they were reacting the way that they.
Well, I figured it out when I heard that Blackmore was killed. You know, that was everybody knew that, you know. And so about a week later, we had 2 PT boats that were stationed on the end of our island there, and I knew some of the guys, and one of the guys had been with President Jack Kennedy on the PT 109 when they were lost, and the island that they went to was only about maybe 3-4 miles from Vella La Vella, where we made and that's where they saved most of Kennedy's crew. So one of the guys was reassigned to another PT boat, and the PT boat was the one at our place. And they were out, and the Battle of Vella Gulf had been, and one of the bigger battles, sea battles, and this PT boat picked up about 30 Japanese seamen, and they had them up in the bow of the PT boat, and they were bringing them back, and they had alerted us that we all had got our rifles out and told us they wanted us to escort the prisoners up to a compound that we had for them, and then they were going to take care of it. And one of the Japanese survivors, prevailed on the PT boat guy. He was the guy who had been with Kennedy on PT 109. He had been reassigned to this ship, and the guy was begging for a glass of water, or some water, and so this guy felt sorry for him, brought him up to the scuttlebutt, they called it, a little drinking fountain, and while he was getting a drink, he reached out and grabbed this guy's .45 and killed this sailor, American sailor. Well, all hell broke loose on the bow of the ship, and they machine gunned about 15 or 20 of them were dead when they got. This was just as they're coming into us, you know. And as we're taking them now, and it's complete bedlam because of this, I'll be darned if we don't get a bomber comes by and drops a bomb. A Japanese bomber came by, and it was crazy. But we got them all up and got the survivors into the thing. But this poor guy, trying to be a nice guy, and he ended up giving his life for that.
And where did that bomb land?
I don't remember. I just know that we knew we were getting an air raid, and they used to they called it a washing machine Charlie. Every night that we were, the first month or two we were on the island, a Japanese plane would come about 11 o'clock at night and just start circling around our island. And their reasoning was to keep everybody awake and to ruin our morale. And then about 4 or 5 in the morning, before daylight, they would drop one bomb, and then they'd split, you know. And that's.
Did their tactics work? Were you able to?
No, we were all in foxholes. One of the guys, he was a little older than me, but he said, "I'm sick of these darn foxholes." So he got an army cot and he set it up right out in the thing. We were all in foxholes at night, you know, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, we heard him scream. He thought he was dead. And what happened? A coconut had fallen out of the tree and hit his bunk, you know, and he thought he was dead. He got back in his foxhole.
The last time he slept out of it.
Yeah. So how I became a ship fitter was an older guy on there, and we'd become friends. And he said, "Bob," he said, "why don't you see if you can go to work for me?" He said, "I have we had about 15 landing craft in our group, and half of them were damaged, either the rudder or the prop, from the coral all around the island. We're always hitting the coral with the props. And so he was going to set up a deal to repair the landing craft. And he said, "If you can get working for me," he said, "I'll get you ship fitter 3rd class within a month or 2. He said, "Otherwise you're going to be a seaman for for a long time because coxswain was a hard rate to pick up, and so I went to my lieutenant, and he said, "Sure, if you want to change, sure." So I went with him. So we went across this little bay, and across the bay was this beautiful sand beach, and there was a great plantation house that had been up there, and it was Australian, and the Japanese had burned it, so it was all burned down, but there were still letters and so forth there from the, and we knew who all the people were that had been the thing because we were reading their letters and stuff. And they had down on by the water there were two 1924 Ford flatbed Model Ts. And I knew cars pretty well by then because I'd had a car since I was 16. And we went down and we got one of these Model Ts running and took it down by the river, down by the beach there, and then took the tire off the wheel, jacked it up, and made a deal for it. And we would hook onto the landing craft. We went up and we cut down about 20 coconut trees and put logs there, and then we would fire up the Model T and hook up to it, and with the rear wheel we'd pull the landing craft up out of the water so we could work on the rudder and the thing. And it was just like it was our own dry dock, you know. And that was, and I loved it because I'm working in this beautiful, clear, beautiful water. And we would just, when we were finished with it, we'd let it back down and bring up another one.
How would you get it back into the water?
We just release it back. We pulled it up with a cable, and then we just release it off of the rear wheel and just put it in reverse, you know. And so we use that Model T as our deal there. And
you had to be inventive and.
Well, you had to be. I mean, we didn't have anything to work with, you know, and that was just the way we were, and so it was very. I enjoyed it because I'm working in this water, and then if when we got hungry over there, we would grab a hand grenade and throw it out in about 4 or 5 feet of the water, and when it would explode, it would stun a bunch of fish up, and we would grab the fish and have fish lunch. You know?
Easy fishing.
Yeah.
So how long were you there?
Okay, so now I'd been there. I was there from August until probably about the 1st of January, sometime the 15th or something of January, I was evacuated from there, and I went down to New Hebrides, and I was a ship fitter now. He was true to his word. He got me 3rd-class ship fitter. So when I was down there, then that's when I was assigned to the USS Dixie.
And this is 1945?
No, it would be 44.
44.
Yeah, because I was about 5 months on the island. Let's see, August, September, October, November, December, January, maybe 5 to 6 months I was on the island. So here we are now, and I'm down there near one of the boats, our little dock down there, and I see this Corsair come by, and I said, wow, he was pretty low. And so I saw him, and I could see he was going to make a circle. And I said to my friend on the dock, I said, hey, that guy's going to put that airplane down here. I just sensed that. And he said, you really think so? I said, I'm pretty sure he's going to put that airplane in. So I said, let's go. So I grabbed a LCVP, a 30-foot landing craft that was right there. And we drove out and we sat in the bay. And sure enough, here he comes back around, and he's just over the coconut trees, comes down to the bay, drops the tail down, and mushrooms the plane like that. He gets out onto the wing of the Corsair, and I picked him up before he got his boots a little wet. That's all he got wet. And I brought him into the beach. By this time, there were a bunch of officers there and so forth, and so they took him away. Never saw him again. And so what happened is they shipped him out of there back, and he had just come back from Bougainville, and he had shot down 3 Zeros that day, and he took quite a bit of damage. He'd been shot up pretty good. And he had about 40 miles more to go down to Munda, where he came from. Airfield we had a Rendezvous in Munda, and he was afraid he couldn't make it, and he didn't want to just crash it at sea. So that's why he jumped on an island that he knew there were Americans on there. And so that's the way that all happened. Well, it turned out when he got back to the States, they shipped him right to Washington, D.C. with his wife, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave him the Medal of Honor because he had 28 kills by this time. He had been out working out of Guadalcanal at first and moved up to Munda. And he was at that time he was the biggest Marine ace that they had, but there's another couple of Marines beat him by 1 or 2 kills
later on.
But
What was his name?
Ken Walsh, and he gave me all of these pictures because I let 60 years go by, and I'm thinking one day in my office down in Paramount, I wonder if that Ken Walsh is still alive. I didn't know. I didn't even know that he got the Medal of Honor at that time. And so I got my phone books out. We had a bunch of phone books for different cities and so forth. I found a Ken Walsh out in the valley, and he was the vice president of Litton Industries. And he said, I know who you're looking for. He said, because I've had mail for him. But he said, I'll help you find him. He said, but if you find him, he said, I want to meet him too. So I said, well, okay. Well, he had a brother in New York who was a newspaper guy and an ex-Marine. Well, in about 15 minutes, he had all the details. He had everything. And Ken Walsh was living out in Riverside. So I called Ken Walsh, and went out to he said, oh, I'd love to meet you, I said, so forth. So we set up a luncheon thing. So I called the other Ken Walsh and told him that we're going to lunch. And so the 3 of us had lunch. And it turned out I played tennis for years with Ken Walsh, that wasn't the pilot, the guy from Litton Industries, and we used to go out, I used to go out to the valley and play tennis with him, and we were good friends for years. And Ken Walsh, the pilot, we became very close, and we would go to lunch about once every 3 or 4 weeks until he died about 3 years ago.
Now, when you guys pulled him out of the, well, not even out of the water, but when you guys rescued him from the plane, did he say anything to you?
Well, the only thing that he did, he got his wallet out. He wanted to make sure that that was dry, and he showed me a picture of his wife, and that's about all the time we had. We didn't have any time, you know, because I just took him to the beach. Can I cross my legs? Yeah. I just took him to the beach and never saw him again until all of this happened. And then he gave me these pictures through the years, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience, you know.
Good thing your intuition was working.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was just, and the funny thing is, it was an easy landing that he made, and of course it was easy. Like I say, I know he didn't get wet much more than his boots, you know, and but a month, 2 months before that, he was down in Espiritu Santos, and they wanted to find out how high they could fly the Corsairs, what altitude they could go. There's a gasoline engine in those airplanes, and so he took it out, and he took it too far. He took it up to probably 38,000 feet, and froze the engine, froze the carburetor, and he couldn't get the plane started again. He came down and he crashed the airplane in the water. It wasn't as nice a landing as this other one. But when he crashed it, he had his thing off. He was ready to get out, and it moved him in a way he couldn't get his seatbelt undone. And he was going down, and he said figures that he was at least 15 feet down, going fast down with the airplane to the bottom. And as a last resort, he had a life preserver on that was inflatable, and he pulled the thing on the life preserver, and it jerked him around enough to where he could get the seatbelt loose, and he popped to the top, and he lived through that. So he was very nervous about making another water landing because he still had that experience behind him, you know.
2 crash landings.
Yeah. He said he was a double ace, you know, because he wrecked 4 Corsairs in his life. And this Roger Conant was another ace. He had 6, this is Roger's picture there. He had 6 aces. And when the day that Ken Walsh was going to Bougainville, they were escorting bombers because they were bombing Bougainville, and he was part of the escort. They'd have the fighter planes escort the bombers, you know, keep the Zeros off, you know. And he just barely took off from Munda with this airplane, and he had a little malfunction in the engine or something. And he said, oh, nuts. He turned around, came back and landed at Munda, got out, and the only plane that was ready was Roger's airplane. These guys they would have their own airplanes as much as they could, because every airplane had little idiosyncrasies that they knew about, and they wanted to have their own plane. But he jumped into Roger Conant's plane and made it up to Bougainville with it. And that's the one that got shot down, of course, and Roger never forgave him for that.
He wasn't too happy, I'm sure.
But I've been to lunch with both of them, with Roger and Ken. You know.
Now, is Roger still alive?
I don't know. I really don't know. I rather doubt it because I know Ken Walsh was probably about 4 years older than me. And I think Roger Connor was at least a couple of years older than me. So he could still be alive. I don't know.
So what happened after you saved Ken?
Well, after I then we had the landing field finished now, and so it's time. They said, you're going to go back down to an airfield, and you're going to be reassigned. And that's when I got on a DC-3 off of the airfield that we had just built. And first time I'd ever been in an airplane, and the first time I'd ever seen the islands from above. They're so beautiful, so many different colors on the reefs and everything. It's absolutely magnificent. And this was a great experience for me. And so I went down to New Hebrides and landed there, and I went into a receiving ship. And so I was only there for a week or so, and I was assigned to the USS Dixie. And the Dixie, I didn't realize it then, the Dixie was the oldest commissioned naval ship in the U.S. Navy.
Is that right?
At that time.
And what type of ship is the Dixie?
She was a destroyer tender. That's her picture up there. And we had about, I think about 700 guys on board, something like that. I'm not sure the number. And Dixie was built in 1940 and still in commission.
All right.
And she had teak decks. I have a piece of the teak right there. And that was a novelty then. I mean, for a warship or for any ship, really. But she had beautifully made ship. You know, she was built in 1940.
Mm-hmm. And did you spend the rest of the war on the Dixie?
Well, I came as close to being injured on the Dixie. I came closer to injury on the Dixie than I ever did in all the things that I've just explained. But because I forgot to tell you, the LST that I couldn't get on went out, and the Japanese hit it with a firebomb, and it sunk. But they got all the guys off. We only lost one man. One chief died. But the destroyers came by and picked everybody up off the LST with all this stuff that we never had unloaded. It went to the bottom.
You had your sea bag that you had pulled off.
And the pictures of my girlfriends, which I had to share with these 25 friends of mine, because they didn't have anything but the shirt on their back.
So two ships that are...
And I had two ships that I was so close to being on, both of them, when they were hit, and I missed them both. So I was living a charmed life.
Your mother's prayers must have worked.
They sure did, but she must have missed out when I got on the Dixie, because, can I tell you the story of...
Absolutely.
This is not necessarily a war story, but it's very interesting.
That's all right.
We had we would always have anywhere from 2 or 3 or 4, sometimes 5 or 6 destroyers tied up alongside. And if you had a job on the 4th destroyer out, you had a hell of a time. You had to crawl from one destroyer to the next to get out to do your job, you know. And that's what the Dixie was doing. It was repairing and refurbishing and restocking, and you know, we had torpedoes and everything on the Dixie.
Now, is this while you guys are out at sea, or are you guys in...
No, we would always be in port,
Yeah.
Dixie, and we would always be 30 miles or so behind the action because we're a repair ship. And the destroyers, when they would get damaged or something, they would come back down to us, and then we would repair them or send them back to Hawaii if they were something we couldn't do, you know. So we were doing, and I was in the sheet metal department, and I learned to make the ducting for the ships, and none of them had 90-degree turns. They'd be 37 or 38-degree turns, you know. And I brought my geometry back from high school, and I learned to lay out ducting just by what I knew. I mean, I could make I could draw the draft and then make the piece to fit that, you know. And I don't know how I did that, but I did that for several years on the Dixie, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it if my life depended on it today. You know? But that's the way it was. So anyhow, here's the story that I have to tell you. We had a guy on board. He was a boatswain's mate, 2nd class, and his name was Cantrell. I can't remember his first name. We all went by last names anyhow. And Cantrell was more or less a hero on this ship because he was an avid boxer. And boxing was a big thing. And we had a great big boat deck on the Dixie, and we could have 300 or 400 guys up there, you know. And so they'd find the best boxer on one of the destroyers, and then he would fight Cantrell. And I watched Cantrell probably a dozen times, and he was an animal. He really was. When he would get somebody down, he wanted to pounce on top of them. It looked like he wanted to kill them, you know. And they were continually pulling him off, you know. After, I mean, he's already beaten the poor guy, and he doesn't want to quit, you know.
Now, is this bare knuckle boxing?
No. They had they were wearing some kind of gloves, I think, as I recall. But anyhow, I remember watching Cantrell do that many times, and so it was really hot we were up on the 2nd deck, and I had this young, well, he wasn't young, he was older than me, came on board, and he was a 3rd class shipfitter. By this time I'd made 2nd class shipfitter. I didn't know that much, you know. And here comes this guy. He was probably 8-9 years older than me, and they gave him a 3rd class shipfitter rate, but he had been working in sheet metal for 20 years, you know. And the first day we had a job, he's my striker. He's working for me, and I immediately realized that he'd forgotten more than I knew about sheet metal work. And so I had a nice talk with him, and I said, look, this is the Navy, you know, I'm the 2nd class and you're the 3rd class. I have to give you the orders, but you know more than I know. So let's just work with it. You can help. I'll do whatever you say. You know? And that's the way we did. And we would do the jobs. And it was great for me because I had an instructor with me.
He made your life easier.
Well, yeah, and I learned more too, you know, because he showed me the right way to do it, to do things, you know. So anyhow, so it was very, very hot where our bunks were. The bunks were this close together type of thing, you know, and not that bad, but it was too hot inside. So I procured somewhere or another 2 army cots, and I gave one to my striker and one to me, and the decking was about the width of this room. The deck was about that wide. There was another deck up on top, you know. But we were the second one. We were about 35 feet off the water from where we were, and with an iron railing around, you know, on the side. And so we set up our 2 little bunks there, and it was perfect because of cool nights and beautiful. So one night we've gone to bed, and my striker was down there and I'm up here, and we're both against the wall there, and here comes Cantrell. He'd got a hold of some torpedo juice, this 180 proof alcohol that they used in the torpedoes, and you could cut that with grape juice or something like that, and it made a hell of a good drink and a strong drink.
So they'd use alcohol in the torpedoes?
Yes, for the guidance system, yeah. And so he being a second-class bosun mate, and everybody on the ship knew him because of his boxing thing, and he was a hero on the ship, really. And so here they come, and they sit down on the rail right across from our 2 bunks. And they're already drunk, and he's got a little third class with him that I could have kicked the hell out of him. And they're both sitting there drinking. So I thought, well, they'll move on pretty soon, and so we'll just ignore them. You know, what else are we going to do? And all of a sudden I hear this explosion, and he gets up off the rail, goes over, and my striker was there on the bunk, and he grabbed hold of his bunk and just threw him out of his bunk against the bulkhead, you know. And my guy fell down. He wasn't hurt that bad, scared the hell out of him. He got up and looked at the situation, and he just took off down the deck, you know. And they go back to their drinking, laughing. They thought that was really funny. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. If he does that to me, I'm too damn big to take that from him. Because I was 6 foot tall, and I was in good shape. I mean, I'd been working out pretty good, and I was in pretty good shape. But not for him, I wasn't. You know, I mean, that's the last thing I wanted to do was to tangle with him. So, anyhow, I'm going to sleep with this thought, you know, I'm too big to take this. And so I finally get off to sleep. And then all of a sudden, Bluey did the same thing to me. Well, and then he went back over and sat down, and they're laughing at me, you know. I got up, and I'm jumping up and down, and I'm saying, I'm too big for that. I mean, it was what I've been thinking all the way. And I went over, and as he started to get up, I pasted him as hard as I could right in the face. And didn't stop him. I mean, he came up, and we got into a wrestling match. And then he moved me around, and he's trying to get me up, and I realized he's trying to throw me over the side. He had me up on top of the rail, and I put my hand out like that, and he bit, my hand went into his mouth, and he bit through this side of my hand so much that you could see through my hand. That's how big a bite he gave me. And that bite gave me enough. I was almost over the side. And had he not bitten me, I think I would have gone over the side, but that gave me an adrenaline punch that I just got back. And so now we're back down there, and and he's getting ready to cold cock me, and by this time there's a little crowd, some people around, and so they said, "Come on, break it up." Well, I was ready to break it up, and so I said, "Okay." So I turned my back on him, started to walk away, and when I turned my back on him, he cold cocked me from the rear and knocked me down, and thank God it was a teak deck, because I slid for probably 10, 15 feet on the deck. I took all the skin off my cheeks and my nose. That's how hard I hit, and I didn't lose consciousness or anything. And he's standing over me, waiting for me to get up, and I'm pretending like I'm unconscious because I don't want to get up. He's going to kill me, And somebody in the crowd said, "That was a dirty trick." And Cantrell turned around and said, "Who said that?" And this big motor Mac, he weighed about 220. He had hands, they were like hams, and very quiet, unassuming guy. He worked up on the boat deck as a motor Mac. He said, "I said it." And Cantrell said, "I'll kill you." And Cantrell went after him, and he went kablooey like that. And he broke his nose and knocked out 3 teeth in one blow. Then it was over. It was all over.
Cantrell finally got his, huh?
Yeah, he got his. Yeah. Half the people on the ship thought I did it. And I never argued it with anybody. But that was, so I came closer, I think I came closer to death on the Dixie in the back lines than I did in the front lines.
They were strafing you and bombing you.
Yeah, right.
So did you continued working on the Dixie for?
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, I continue working on the Dixie. This is good too, because I had a friend of mine. He was a second class, just like I was, and well, we were ready. We got word that we were going to go to Australia. The ship. The ship hadn't been on liberty for almost 3 years. Been out in the Pacific, the whole thing, and the guys on board that had 30 and 32 months without any liberty or anything, just on board ship. And so word came out that we're going to Australia for R&R, and we were on our way to Australia. We got our blues out and everything. We were getting all ready to go, because Australia was a great place to go. The girls loved the sailors down there and so forth. And then all of a sudden, the Battle of the Marianas started. And if they call it our turkey shoot, we shot down 500 Japanese airplanes in the Battle of the Marianas. And when that battle started, our ship just made a U-turn because they knew they were going to need us, because there was all kinds of stuff going on now. And so we never made it to Australia. But we got back up. And so now Bobby Board was a friend of mine. He was a second-class shipfitter also. He was on a fireboat in San Pedro when he joined the Navy. And he was scheduled. I had about 23 months overseas then, and he had about 30 months. And he was scheduled to go back to school in San Diego. I didn't know what school it was or anything. And I don't know I never found out what happened, but the lieutenant of our group got mad at Bobby Board for some reason. And he was scheduled to leave the next day to go back to school in San Diego. And the lieutenant took him off the list. I was the next second class in line. They came to me and said, "You're leaving in the morning, you're going to school." They didn't say what school, they didn't say anything, You're leaving in the morning, you're going to school. And you do what they tell you, So I went and I apologized to Bobby Board, and he said, "Look," he said, "you might as well just enjoy it." He said, "It's not your fault that this happened." He said, "I'll deal with it, So I was on the ship back to San Francisco. And I got back to San Francisco and came down and went on 30-day leave, just coming back. And that's when I was on a 30-day leave. Halfway through is when they dropped the bomb, and that was the end of the war. But I'm still scheduled to go back down after my leave was over to go to San Diego and go to school. I found out the school was underwater welding school. And that's, in those days, diving was not like it is today, And so I went to 8 weeks of school in San Diego, arc welding and settling welding underwater in a swimming pool, And I learned to do that. And of course, had the war not been over, I would have been on the coast of Japan underwater probably. Doing something. I have a feeling. And as it turned out, I graduated from the school, 8 weeks of underwater welding. 2 days later, they discharged me. That's Navy planning.
You got the free education there.
Oh, it was marvelous. It couldn't have been better.
Good timing.
Yeah.
And so when you learned, when you learned that you were going to be headed back to the States for school, I imagine you were probably happy to get.
I was thrilled, and of course I was thrilled to be home and then to have the war over. That was fabulous. And my poor little sister that talked me into doing that thing, she and her girlfriend, John Garzon, my Coast Guard friend that was killed in the explosion of the ship, his younger sister and my younger sister were best friends. And when we dropped the bomb and when the war was over, I took the two girls, they were 14 years old then, And my mother was a teetotaler. She didn't like drinking at all. My dad kind of liked a little bit, but he couldn't handle it, so he didn't drink very much. But
For an Irishman, that doesn't sound.
that's right. That's right. But he was okay. But I took my my sister and her girlfriend, John's sister, out and got them tipsy because everybody was partying with the war over, and brought those two girls home. They weren't drunk, but they had enough that they were tipsy. And my poor mother, here I am. I just came back from 26 months in the South Pacific, and I'm getting her daughter drunk at the same time. But she handled it. She just zipped.
She was happy to have you back.
Of course, yeah.
So you were discharged.
Yeah, and that was all there was to it. Turned out, just by a coincidence, it was January the 19th, 1946. So I was in for exactly 3 years, not for any reason other than it was just happened that way.
How funny.
Yeah.
Now, what did you do after the war?
Well, okay. I got a great story for you. I came back. My mother had decided that for the war, she wanted to help all she could. And so she my dad had a little truck, and he was going to some of the war plants with his we built the first catering trucks. We cut the size out of a panel truck and did it ourselves, and made the first catering trucks that were ever used. And my mother had a catering truck, and she had a big, big route. But one of her biggest routes was down in the area where all the trains came in, the Union Pacific. And her quarter to 12 stop, you had a whole bunch of different stops that you'd go to every day and to make the route. And her quarter to 12 stop, there were about 45 Mexican girls that worked there cleaning the coaches, personal coaches. They'd be cleaning all the coaches, and then when the whistle would blow, 45 of them come out, hit the truck, So these girls are watching. My mother is breaking me in, teaching me how the route works and everything for me to take over. So finally, after a week of this, the day comes, I'm on my own. So I get there, and I set my little tray up with the cigarettes on it, and the rest of the stuff, they just go to the truck and help themselves, and they come through and pay me in the line. Well, about the fourth girl that came through to pay me, I had my money changer on, She reaches under my money changer and grabs me by the balls and threw me into complete shock. All of these girls knew that Angie was her name, knew that Angie was going to do this, and they were just breaking up. And I think half of them just walked off and didn't even pay me that day, because it was complete chaos, And when I left, I thought, whoa, what am I going to do? And I thought about it all night long. I got to go back there tomorrow again, So I got this idea. I went into our kitchen and I found a aluminum pie pan. I put 2 holes in it and put a line around it. And so before I got to the stop, I took this pie pan and put it underneath my changer and tied it on like this. And standing there waiting for the girls to come by. When the girls saw this, they just went bonkers. They just laughed so hard, you know. And Angie, the one that had caused all the problem, became my close friend. And Angie, for the rest of the time that months I was running that thing, Angie would stand beside me, make sure that all the girls paid me. She wouldn't let anybody get away with anything. She was my associate.
That's an interesting way to start a friendship.
I know. But that's just wonderful. And the funny thing is, just yesterday, I called Cleo Doherty, a widow of a dear friend of mine. Rich Doherty took over I broke him in on my route a few months after I had run my mother's route. And I went out and got another truck, and I built a route of my own. But Rich worked for my dad through me. And I was talking to Cleo. Rich died about 5 years ago. And we were very, very good, close friends, you know, for all the years after the war. And turns out Cleo told me something yesterday that I didn't know. I didn't realize, I probably knew it and forgot, but Rich was in the Coast Guard also, and he was in the Philippines. I was in the Philippines on the Dixie, and he was in the Philippines on a Coast Guard small ship, and they took a couple of hits from Japanese, and he got the Purple Heart. And I didn't know until yesterday that Rich got the Purple Heart. He never talked about it or anything, you know. And here I am, 70 years later or whatever, and I find this out, you know, in a conversation. Isn't that wild?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess you can never really know everything about a person.
That's true. Yeah, it's just crazy.
So how long did you do the catering
route
for?
I built 12 routes, my own. I never, you know, and I would get a route and I'd build it up. You lose money when you first start because you have to have a certain amount of sandwiches, and you might only sell 4 and you got 40, you know. I mean, but so it's a losing thing. But as you get to the building, get it built up, then it becomes good. And when I get it high enough to where I can charge a lease for it and hire a driver, and the driver can make a good living, that's a good route. And so I had 12 very nice, strong routes that I built every account that I ever had, you know. And then it turns out my younger brother had 8 routes out by the airport, and he wanted to go into the real estate business. And so I bought his routes from him, paid him a monthly thing, and that way he'd have time to build, and he built a wonderful thing in real estate. He made millions of dollars. He did very well. And then my other brother wanted to build a freezer and sell to the catering houses. And he had about 7 routes himself. And so he had a conflict of interest by having the routes and selling to different catering houses. So I bought his routes too. So I ended up with 27 routes, as it turned out. And Then when the hot trucks came along, where we call them hot trucks, where they cook on the truck and have a cook, and so they're so popular now with all the taco trucks and all this stuff.
Yeah.
This is all a takeoff from ours, you know. And our trucks originally, for the first 25 years I was in the business, we had a commissary that they would make hamburgers there and put them together, cold, wrapped, and then I would have a charcoal oven that I would put the hamburgers in and heat them up, and then sell them as a hot hamburger. But we didn't cook anything on the things. Everything was done in the commissary.
And what was the name of the business?
Pacific Catering was mine. And so, but we would, we had a big catering house. I just called my trucks Pacific Catering, but high-grade food distributors was a big one. And there were about 8 of us that owned that. We all had trucks, 4 to 50 trucks, you know, whoever it was. And I decided after I had to buy 2 or 3 hot trucks because I was going to lose some good accounts because some of the people were requesting that. And so I went into management at Honda, and they called me and they said, Bob, they said, these people say they want a hot truck. I said, how long do I have? She said, well, whatever. I said, give me 3 weeks. He said, sure, no problem. So I went out and bought a hot truck and put it in there, you know. And it did okay. But I didn't like the business anymore. And so here I had 27 routes. So I ended up calling in all of my drivers one at a time, told them, here's the deal. If you continue to pay me the lease that you're paying now for your route, and if you will pick up the expenses on your truck repair and the licensing and permits that are needed, in the end of 5 years, I'll sign everything over to you, and it'll be your business. And the trucking route was worth probably $40,000 to $60,000 then, you know. And what I'm so proud of is, of those 26 deals, every one of them made it to the end.
It's pretty good.
And some of the guys are still running the same routes.
Right?
They might not be the same, but basically they're the same, you know.
So once you left the catering business, where did you go from there?
Well, when I left the catering business, I heard that we had bought a little paper. We started a paper company, 3 or 4 of us, because we were using so much paper cups and stuff in our catering house that we started a paper company. And we had a manager, and it was doing okay, and we were selling to other catering houses and everything. And they picked up a deal, and they were serving paper and stuff to Pup and Taco. Do you ever hear that? Pup and Taco was a father and son in Long Beach. They lived in Long Beach, and they had started this Pup and Taco chain, and they had 110 stores, all the way from San Diego up to the other side of Ventura. And this paper company was trying to serve them the paper, and they weren't happy, but it wasn't working very well. And so I said, let me talk to them. So I talked to the father and son that had and I took over from the paper company, because I had a building where I kept my trucks and so forth, and so anyhow, I started for them, and I did everything for Pup and Taco except produce and the meat. Everything else that they needed, papers and pickles and everything that they needed. And Coca-Cola at that time, we used, they called it a 5 gallons. It'd be a 5-gallon stainless steel container with just the syrup. I became the largest distributor for Coca-Cola on the West Coast because I had 110 stores that were exclusively Coca-Cola. They didn't have Pepsi. And everything was going beautiful. I had a manager. I could just go down to my office and just check things out and so forth. And I actually didn't really have to do anything with it. And I was making maybe $40,000 a year off of it, So I could do anything else I wanted to do, and it was a nice deal. Well, Taco Bell, who is connected with Pepsi-Cola now, they wanted these 110 stores. You know why? They wanted to switch from Coca-Cola to Pepsi-Cola. Be one big thing for them. They paid $26 million to the father and son for the whole thing. Probably 5 or 6 million more than it was worth. But they were so wanted that switch over to Pepsi from Coke, and because they were warring at each other at that time. And but it blew me out. I mean, there was nothing left there. So I did that. Then I went into the wine and champagne business, and I got a friend of mine that I'd been through grammar school with, worked for WWII wineries up in Montecito, and they had a deal with the whatchamacallit, I can't say it, Hilton hotels, and they furnished them all of their mid-value wine. And at that time, it was very popular to have companies would have a big convention, and they would have maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people there, and they would have it like the Hilton Hotel. They'd use all this wine, and so I got in the middle of it, and I became the distributor. Now, Pepsi-Cola, not Pepsi-Cola, but the people at Hilton and Montecito Wine, WWII Winery, they knew what prices were, and they kept me at about 10% markup. But I ran it just like it was. I bought the wine from the winery and then sold it to the Hiltons, but they made sure that I didn't make any more than 10%, which was fine because I was doing very well with it. And so I had a house in Catalina, and I started the champagne that WWII was making for the Hiltons was a real nice champagne for the average person. The real connoisseur wouldn't like it because it was too sweet. But most people, like if they go out to a breakfast, lunch type of thing, that they had so many of, they'd serve champagne. they could use this champagne because it was the most of the people liked that. And my wife being one, my wife just loved their champagne. She thought it was great. So I said, well, by George, it wouldn't hurt anyone if I just took the labels off of this and made a Catalina label out of it. Well, my wife was a good artist, and my wife made up a thing. There's a couple of bottles up there. I'll show you. And with the Catalina label on it. So I went out and bought a couple of big galvanized tubs, and I'd put 4 or 5, 6 cases of the Hilton champagne in there, let it soak overnight. In the morning, all the labels fall off. I'd dry them off, and I bought a little light labeling machine, and I would label them with the Catalina label and ship them over to Catalina and get about 3 times the money that I was getting before, and not hurting anyone, you know. Yeah. Everybody was okay. And I had the little 187s, the individual bottles, all the bed and breakfasts over there. They loved them, because when you would rent a room for the night or whatever, they would put a little 1 shot of champagne bottle on there, you know, for you. And so I was selling all sizes over there. All the liquor stores was handling it. Everybody. It was a big thing. I did it for a number of years.
Very clever.
Yeah, well, it worked out. It worked out good. It was a nice little side issue, and the good thing about it was a win-win thing. Nobody was hurt by it, you know.
Yeah. Now, you said that your wife, she's fond of animals, and you said you guys had started a sanctuary.
Our place, well, what we called on our front door, it said, "This place is a zoo."
And it literally was.
No question about it.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh gosh, yes. She just she was a saint, as far as a lot of people thought, because we were 45 years in this house where we just moved from, up in Palos Verdes. And when we moved in, well, we were in Long Beach before that, and we had a great big beautiful Spanish style house that I would never thought I would ever leave, because we bought it, and I was way over my head when I bought it, but we made it work, and it was 5,800 square feet. The living room was 30 by 50, size of a basketball court. Fabulous house. Great big hand-painted beam ceilings, everything. It was more than you could ever ask for. But we were living there, and we had 5 bedrooms in the house. And upstairs in 1 bedroom, we had Sadie and Henry were in that bedroom. That was 2 chimpanzees. And the next bedroom down, there were 2 woolly monkeys who were in there, you know. And in the swimming pool, we had 2 river otters that lived there, and they slept down in the heater room for the pool. Alongside of the house, we had a wallaby and a wallaroo, which is half kangaroo and half wallaby. Stands about that high. They were down the side of the house, and I could open the French doors that came into my pool room. I had bought an old pool table and put it in there. And if my guests were drinking too much of my vodka, I would just open the door, and Tilly would pop in and she was damn near, she was that tall, and she would come popping through the room, about 4 or 5 foot hops all through the room. And these guys, some of them, they'd quit drinking, you know.
Not a common sight.
No, it sure wasn't. And that was just the way we lived. And I knew this couldn't continue because we had no permits or anything.
How would you guys acquire the animal?
Well, the two, Sadie and Henry, the two chimps, there was this guy, I don't even know what his name was. He was in Libya, and he was in downtown Libya. The natives came in, and they had these two chimps. They had probably just shot the mother and taken the babies, and they were just months old, about this big. And he bought the two chimps in Libya for $10 a piece, you know, and brought them home. And he lived in Long Beach. And then he found out how much work they are to take care of. And he just, and a friend of ours knew about him and so forth, and told my wife, and my wife went down and took the chimps from him, you know. And we raised those two chimps. We kept them till they were 7 years old. And then we took them out to a friend of ours that we had heard about just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. And he was a pediatrician, but he was working for the zoo. And they had a chimp there that they thought that he had some kind of a disease, that they were going to put the chimp down. And Howard, the pediatrician, said, no, don't put that chimp. I'll take that chimp. And he bought 20 acres outside of Phoenix, and he had a moat all the way around it, water, and there was a house on the property and some bunch of trees. And he started taking chimps in. When the chimps would get to be over 7 or 8 years old at the most, they had mind of their own, and they were so strong that they could do anything they wanted to do, you know. Their hands are 5 times strong as ours are, you know. And so the movies and the TV people, they couldn't handle them when they got older. So they'd get a younger chimp, and then they didn't know what to do with it. So Howard ended up, he had about 15 chimps out there. And they formed a little colony, you know. And there was this one chimp, she was a big old female, and she had a baby. Somebody got her pregnant. And she had a baby, and the little baby's name was Juan. And he was about a year old. And he would go out and he would tease the other chimps. And when they would get where they couldn't take it any longer, they would chase Juan, and Juan would run to his mother, and then the mother would beat up this chimp that was chasing her baby. And this was a going on thing until we brought Sadie and Henry down there. And Sadie was she was fabulous. I loved her, absolutely loved her. And she had a personality. I mean, she had a sense of humor. She had everything, you know, unbelievable. More than you would think an animal would have. And so one day Juan was after Sadie, just teasing Sadie. And Sadie went after Juan, and Juan ran to his mother. And Sadie just beat the hell out of the mother. And from that day on, Sadie was the leader of the whole thing, you know. I mean, colony, yeah. She was the number one kid. So we were down visiting Sadie and Henry. We would go down every couple of 3 months and visit them. They remember this, you know. And so we were down there one time, and Howard had this chimp that these people in San Francisco had this chimp. His name was Mr. Coleman. And he had in San Francisco, he had his own room. He used the bathroom. He flushed the toilet. He wiped his butt. He did everything that we do. And he was more like a human than an animal, you know. But something happened with this couple, and they had to find a home for him. So they wanted Howard to take him. Well, he didn't want to take him because this chimp had been castrated, and he was afraid the other chimps wouldn't accept him. But the people prevailed, and finally Howard agreed to do it. And he was completely right, because he put Coleman out there, and the other chimps were just beating up on him, something terrible. I mean, it just didn't work. And he was in a separate cage, and he looked like a prisoner of war survivor or something. He was just a mess. And so we saw this when we went down to visit Sadie and Henry. And Gwen, it made me cry. She cried all the way home. And when we got home, we talked to Howard. Called. He said, Gwenna, he said, if you would be willing to take this chimp, please do, you know. Gwenna says, we'll be down. And we turned right around and went back down to Arizona and brought Mr. Coleman home. And we had him for about 8 years. And he died with, he got bone cancer and was going to cost us $60,000 and no guarantee that he'd live through it. And we said, no, not because he was already pretty old. And wonderful chimp. And I have pictures of him here, I'll show you. And he was just great. And in fact, I was skiing in Colorado when he was dying, and I talked to him on the telephone, and he recognized my voice, you know. Yeah.
It's pretty special.
Yeah. So we had and it was a great experience. It was an expensive proposition, but.
You said at one point you guys had over 100 and how many?
Well, about 180, maybe you could even say 200, you know. But it was a big supply and see, animal control and fish and game, both, they don't call it fish and game anymore. They call it something else, but fish and game is okay. And their truck would be at our house at least once a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, with anything from a raccoon to a skunk or whatever, you know.
Dropping it off.
Yeah, they didn't have any facility. They would have to euthanize all these animals. And the same way with the little marmoset monkey. Marmosets are only about this big, full grown, you know. Well, you can buy a marmoset for $600 down in Las Vegas. They have them for sale down there. They're against the law to have them here unless you have a permit, and it's really hard to get a permit. And so people would buy them down there and smuggle them up here, and then a neighbor would report it or something, animal control would pick it up. They don't know what to do with it. They'd bring it to Gwenna. We had 40 marmosets. And they were and marmosets always had twins.
once they mate, they just.
That when they would have a baby, instead of just having one baby, 90% of the time they would have twins. That's just the way they were made, and it was got ridiculous. We had to separate the male from female because we didn't want any more. Now I knew what we should do. I mean, I should have taken 4 or 5 of those marmosets, take them down and sell them to the guys in the Vegas thing for $200 a piece. They're going to sell them for $600. They're going to come back up here with somebody, and then they're going to get them, and I'm going to get them back. And I figured that should be, you know. But my wife was such a straight arrow, she wouldn't hear of it. I was serious to do that.
I believe you. Your business acumen kicked in there. Now, what were some other exotic, unconventional animals that you guys would take in?
Oh, let's see what.
Because that's not your normal household pet.
No. Of course, we had those too. You know, we always had plenty of dogs and cats and so. And Mickey, my daughter, raised a black leopard from a baby to about 4 years, but the leopard had 2. What do you call them? Calves, or not? Two babies, anyhow, 2 cubs, and they called it. Their eyes would go up like this. They had some kind of a disease, both of them, and but my daughter kept her black leopard. And he would he'd love to get in my warehouse, and I've got pictures up on my cases of wine, you know, and so forth. And but he died at a young age and we expected him to die, and both of them died. But and we raised a couple lion cubs because Tippi Hedren had gone to school with my wife, Gwenna. And Tippi Hedren, you remember who she was? Remember the picture Birds?
Yeah.
Well, Tippi Hedren was the lead in that.
Okay.
And she's a movie star.
Yeah.
And she has 60 acres out on the way to Mammoth. Mm-hmm. And she has elephants. He has 2 elephants there, and a bunch of all kinds of cats. I mean, cougars and lions and tigers. And everything. She has a big thing with probably hundreds of animals, I think. And so when she got flooded about 25 years ago. We had a big rain, and she had a lot of problems, and we took 2 of her lion cubs, and we kept them at our house in my garage. They destroyed my garage. The carpeting in it, I had carpeting in there. But they were beautiful. But they were young. But they finally, when they were about probably 10 months old, we called Tippi and said, well, we can't keep them any longer, you know. By that time, she was okay, and we brought them back out there to her. You know.
What were you feeding the lions?
That was my wife's thing. She handled it, yeah. I don't know what she was. She would give them whatever they needed, I'm sure. Yeah.
And your monthly food bill must have been.
If you want the truth, I hate to tell this because it sounds terrible, but over the 40 years, she spent very close to $1.5 million doing her thing. Now, we had a deal when we were first married. I'm an avid skier. Always have. I was for 65, 70 years. And I took Gwen to all the major resorts, and we finally realized, she told me, she said, Bob says, she learned to ski, and she was okay. She was a good athlete because she was in high school. She played basketball with the boys. I mean, that's how good she was. And but she did not like the cold weather and didn't like the cold in the skiing. So I made a deal with her. I said, okay, honey, this was early in our marriage. I said, you can do anything you want with the animals. That was my first mistake. I said, you can do anything you want with the animals as long as I can go skiing whenever I can put it together. And we lived by that for 30, 40 years.
Very
good. And it was worth every penny. I've been helicopter skiing at least 6 times.
Jumping out of a helicopter?
Not jumping out, but being taken up by a helicopter.
Okay.
And the reason you do that is so you can get untracked snow. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it'll be up to your knees, and sometimes just to your ankles, And so I had to learn to ski powder and so forth. But I was so lucky to do that because I did it when it was, I think that's the front door, but we're not going to answer. But what was I saying?
About the skiing.
Yeah, it was, I was making a point and I can't remember what it was. Doesn't matter. You can't make all the points.
Well, like I said, I just have a few more questions.
Sure, I'm enjoying it.
Do you have any advice or wisdom that you could offer for future generations?
Well, my advice would be, at my age, I know what the advice is. Remember that we're only on this earth for a short period of time. And what we have to be prepared for is the other side. And let's go there with as clean a bill as we can have.
Wonderful. I'm just going to grab a piece of paper real quick. I've been asking people through social media, to offer questions to World War II veterans. So these are some of the questions that they've proposed. In turn, I'll share your answers with them. So they may kind of not go in order, but and I may be re-asking some things that we already touched on. But what was your motivation that helped you make it through the war? Was there anything that kind of kept you going?
I feel personally that it was the best 3 years of my life. It was a big adventure to me. I'd never been out of Los Angeles. And all of a sudden I found myself on a ship heading for places that I never thought I would ever go to, And it was all a great experience. I was scared a few times, as I mentioned earlier, but for the most part, it was, I hate to say that, but it was an enjoyable experience for me because everything I was doing was new to me, and I enjoyed it. I was at the right age to go. In fact, I'll tell you, when we were on Vela Vela, we brought the Seabees in to build the airfield. Now the Seabees are all guys probably in their 30s and late 30s and probably 50, up to 50, you know, because they were guys who run the machinery and stuff. And we would get mail call. We'd get our mail, and usually when you'd get your mail, you'd sit on a coconut log someplace and read your mail. And I was noticing the Seabees, they'd be sitting there reading their mail and they'd be crying. You know? And I was dumb enough to think, why are these guys crying? You know, because I missed my parents at home and my brothers and sisters, but I was having the time of my life in a way, you know, and I couldn't understand why these guys. Now I know why they were crying. You know, they had families at home and everything else, and that's the best way I can describe my feelings for that.
Perfect. Did you carry any personal items or effects throughout the war?
No. The only thing I carried was my what do they call them? My little ID.
The dog tags?
Dog tag, yeah. That's the only thing that I still have that today.
But you didn't carry anything non-issued, non-issued to you?
No.
Okay. All right. And lastly, I think you already answered this earlier, but why did you pick the branch you served in?
Well, because I like the water. That's the best way I can say that. And I thought I would be interested in boats, which I ended up being very interested in boats all of my life from that time on. But I hadn't even been on a boat at the time I joined the Navy, you know. I joined the Sea Scouts, but they didn't have a boat.
Wonderful. Well, lastly, I just want to thank you very much for sitting down and speaking with me, and obviously for the freedom that I enjoyed today.
Yes, yeah.
So thank you very much.
Great.